Good morning, everyone. On this very cold morning, we're going to be talking about a hot topic called qualitative approaches. So let us start. What are the goals of today's workshop? Well, first, I'm going to introduce you to the characteristics of qualitative approaches. What are its basic characteristics? Now, we're talking about a huge field, but I'm going to say overall, what are the characteristics of a qualitative approach? And what I'd like you to keep in mind is that qualitative approaches, or the narrative turn in methodology, came about through some social scientists feeling that the quantitative and the positivistic approaches to gathering facts about our social worlds were incomplete or incorrect. So a lot of this in the qualitative approaches is a reaction. I'm quickly going to look at sampling in qualitative approaches. Then we're going to look at some qualitative data collection techniques, such as ethnography, qualitative interviewing, focus groups, and visual methods. I'm going to talk about how we analyze qualitative data. Then we're going to weigh up the relative strengths and weaknesses of going qualitative. And my whole goal with this workshop is for you to gain confidence in your own ability to make informed judgments about what is the best strategy for your study. Now, first of all, when you choose the qualitative path, you need to understand why you chose this path. Why were you drawn to qualitative? Please don't just think, okay, I'm a bit scared of statistics or numbers. That is not a good enough reason to choose qualitative, because qualitative is very different. If you choose qualitative, it needs to match your research problem and your objectives. And I'm going to show you a little bit later what a qualitative research problem looks like. You must be assured that your qualitative journey will lead you to answer your posed research question. Plus, qualitative is inductive. Now, that's different from the deduction in quantitative. With quantitative, the deduction was, here is my hypothesis, or here's my research question, and this is going to be my answer. But look at that fourth bullet point. It says, well, new questions arise. Qualitative is what we call an ampliative approach, amplifying, adding new. So once you have completed your study, it must give rise to new questions that even goes beyond your research questions. They're in your recommendations phase of your study. You must be faced with new questions. How are you situated in your own project and study? You would see later we say in qualitative, the researcher is the most important instrument. Therefore, you always need to reflect on why have I chosen this path and who am I as the most important instrument in this study? What are your responsibilities as an ethical qualitative researcher? It presents different ethics than with a quantitative studies. How are your research participants situated in this project? In a qualitative study, we don't try to be objective or value-free as we would in positivism. We try to see the world through the eyes of our research participants, and therefore we need to ask, how are the people situated in this study themselves? What are the problems of praxis? Praxis is, what is the value of my research? Is it valuable? Rigor. Now, rigor doesn't mean just structuring. Rigorous research is not something that only belongs to the quantitative field. Research rigor also occurs in qualitative. That means that I carefully think about all my steps and that I report them in my writing. struggling with the unreadability that comes from Patty Lather's work on getting lost feminist efforts towards a doubled science. She talks about the unreadability, the fact that we are foreigners intruding in the lives of others and trying to capture their lived experiences. What are the problems we are likely to face? So these are the questions you need to answer when you choose the qualitative path. And as I said before, what we need is to stay true to the path we have chosen. I'm going to contrast two views of a forest, as I call it. Let's look at that picture there. It looks lovely. We've got a bubbling brook. We see the mosses. We see the trees. We see the shadows through the trees, the light glinting on the water, and it's rich and impactful. So the qualitative view is one that is situated in space and time. It is specific to where I'm doing my research. It includes variety, because look, we didn't just focus on one aspect. We've got the whole holistic picture there. It's about process and story. It is about emergent design, things that are happening in that space, in that moment, I write up. It means immersion. Immersion means that you are so situated in the site where you are gathering your data that everything comes to you and you are richly describing it. And that immersion leads to what we call thick description. It is messy work. There's a lot of head work. When you do qualitative, it's not easier. It is more difficult because your field work needs to be so rich. And at the heart is the firm belief in the benefits of exploring and describing social meanings, lived experiences, and perceptions. I want you to look at all those keywords: exploring, exploratory research; describing, descriptive research. And what are we exploring and describing? Social meaning. What is social meaning? How people interpret what is happening around them. How do they make sense of their lived experiences? And it's about perceptions. Now, if we contrast this with a quantitative view of the forest, we see logs being stacked together. And we see it's cleaned up data, it is standardized, it is removed from its context there in the forest, and it's about theory building. So always think that what makes qualitative different from my quantitative? There are some unique characteristics of a qualitative approach. The first is that what you want to do in a qualitative study is to see through the eyes of your research participants. I'm describing a world through the lived experiences of someone else. Therefore, it is subjective rather than objective. I'm not value free. I am actually part of what is happening around me. The emphasis is on context. And people, this is so important. If you choose qualitative, you need to know how to write well. You need to write the story. So every experience, whether it is reporting on a focus group, or whether it is telling the story of a transect walk that you've done, or whether it is reporting on a qualitative interview, you need to describe the context from where this response arose from. In other words, your words must be so vivid that I, as the reader, can think that I walked with you through your field work and experienced things with you. It's about process, life history, events, and lived experiences. So in qualitative, our samples are purposefully chosen, not through random sampling, purposefully chosen for diversity rather than random. And when I get to samples, I'll try and unpack this a little bit better. It also is a flexible design. You need to be comfortable with contradictions if you're going qualitative, because there aren't recipes. things come to you in the field when you do your research that you need to be able to deal with, and there's a lot of ambiguity in it. And Luca describes it, it's almost like salsa dancing. There is some structured moves, but a lot of improv that also comes along in qualitative, because we want to make this natural. It's not an artificial environment, it's a naturalistic approach, and therefore there's a little bit of improv that needs to happen. It's all about representations. In other words, we represent this lived experience of our participants through ethnographic prose, a historical narrative. Where did this person come from? What is their life history? We give first-person accounts. We can have biographical and autobiographical materials. What do we mean when we're talking qualitative? Qualitative research examines how shared meanings are accomplished through social interaction. The observer or the researcher is inseparable from the study. You are the instrument. They study things in their natural setting. That's why I said there's a lot of improv that needs to happen. We attempt to make sense all the time, to interpret phenomena in terms of meanings that people bring to them. And what we want to have in the end is to promote a deep, holistic understanding of that particular phenomenon that you chose to focus on. It helps us capture the ways in which people interpret their events, their experiences, and their relationships. Participants are asset-bearing. In other words, we don't think of our participants as we as the researcher are hierarchically superior to our participants. We realize that we're walking amongst them and that they bring to this research encounter the richness of their experience, the knowledge that they hold inside their own lives, and therefore they are embodied and active contributors to the facts that we find. Your research design for a qualitative study. You need to have a typically qualitative research question. And those research questions would ask, what is the nature of this phenomenon? Or how do people perceive or experience or respond to or define a particular thing? Look at the example. What is the lived experiences of loneliness amongst frail older people aged 65 and older living in care homes? And accounts of aging and loneliness can be patronizing due to ageist stereotypes that simplifies and stigmatize later life. So these researchers are very aware that they don't want to impose what they've read in the material on their research participants. They're going to find how they live with this phenomenon called loneliness. It is a coherent research design. You link your research question to your objectives, the reasons for your choices, the gaps in the knowledge that you wish to address, and your analytical strategy. Here's another example. This qualitative study intends to uncover how frail older people living in care facilities experience and respond to loneliness. Data will be collected through non-participant observation at 2 care homes, 101 hours, and interviews with 22 residents. Interviewees will be recruited with the help of staff and only include residents able to grant consent, that's informed consent, to participate. Field notes and interview data, transcribed verbatim, are analyzed thematically to identify patterns and differences in the understandings of and responses to loneliness. If you read these examples, you see all the key words that typically describes a qualitative study being used in these examples. The qualitative research problem statement. Now let me just not stop with the notion problem statement. A research problem statement is very difficult to write. To me, being a seasoned researcher, it is the most difficult part to write. We often go back to our research problem and ask ourselves, what is this one thing that I want to accomplish in the study, in my article, in my book, whatever. It is very difficult. But once you've got that problem statement down, it is the thing that anchors everything that you do. So I don't want to underplay how very difficult it is to write a good research problem statement, but if you get it right, then you're halfway there. A research problem statement, students, is not the same as a research question or the questions that you're going to ask in your interview schedule. It is that overarching thing. It's that problem that you want to uncover through your research. And I think sometimes the wording of this leads us a little bit astray, because we see the word problem and we think, okay, it all needs to be about a problem, something negative. No, a problem statement, a research problem statement is just, what is your study about? And it doesn't have to be always a problem, a social problem, because if we're only problem orientated in all our research, then we re-traumatize ourselves and our participants and people who read it. So it's not always about a social problem. Sometimes our research could be about people overcoming a problem. For example, a particular intervention being very successful, or a particular NGO really resolving an issue for a community, or people in a community who have found a sustainable way of overcoming a particular challenge that they had. So it can be positive. The word problem statement just means, what is that thing that you want to study? So it needs to be focused and specific. It's stating what the researcher wants to learn from doing this study. It is particularistic, understanding of single cases or settings, or a purposeful selection of participants. It is open and emerging, but unfortunately in our training we write proposals, so we can't leave it too open. We need to give some of the parameters and then say in our proposals we leave ourselves open for that exploration and discovery that will also come along in the qualitative. It is non-directional, so avoid the terminology that infers quantitative research, such as effect, influence, impact, cause, or amount to. Those are quantitative keywords. Qualitative keywords is about understanding, discovering, describing, and exploring. So make sure that you use the right words that is actually suitable for qualitative research. If you want to go and look at how one thing influences another or the impact of something, then you're going to go quantitative. So qualitative is about the how-to questions. Booth, Colum, and Williams says that the qualitative research problem denotes incomplete knowledge, something we don't yet know, or a flawed understanding, something we might have gotten wrong. You solve it by changing the world, not by changing the world, but by understanding the world a little bit better. So the problem statement also illustrates why we care, because we are involved. We are not objective, we are subjective. So in our problem statement, we also say, why do we care about this issue? Why should the study be conducted? Because it shouldn't always be social problem oriented, but it must always be socially relevant and significant to do our research. Maxwell gives us two hints for qualitative research problem statements. He says if you write a descriptive research problem statement, you will ask what is going on regarding this phenomenon. And if you write an interpretive research problem statement, you will go ask about the meaning of things, about the meaning of situations, and the conditions for the people who are involved in this issue. So here's a little checklist for your qualitative research problem statement. First of all, ask yourself, is the problem appropriate for qualitative inquiry? Remember what I said, don't go and quantify. If you're wanting to look at impact or compare groups, maybe you need quantitative. So go and look, is this problem best resolved through a qualitative inquiry? Is the problem situated within the literature? That is the literature used to place the problem within a context? You're going to discover that context, but you're going to first consult the literature just to see what are the contours of this problem that you can go and find out for yourself. Then you ask yourself, is your problem clearly and unambiguously stated? Is your problem narrow in scope? Because in qualitative, we're looking at a very purposefully selected case study or number of purposefully selected interviewees or focus groups, so we need to narrow our scope. Is the purpose clearly stated? Is the research question answerable and able to shed light on the problem? Is your own perspective as a researcher and your relationship to the issue discussed, that reflexivity because you're involved? Do you reveal your own assumptions and biases? Is a convincing argument explicitly or implicitly made for the importance or the significance of the research, because we also need to illustrate why we care? Here's an example from another published study. The problem was this. The research indicates that a significant number of people in doctoral programs complete all the course requirements, yet they do not go on to complete the research or produce their dissertations. Hence, despite their significant investment in time and money, these people never receive the doctoral degree that they set out to obtain, and thus they remain without completing the degree. There is little information as to why this phenomenon occurs. So the purpose or the problem statement is then the purpose of this multi-case study, so more than one case study is going to be used, is to explore. Explore is a typical qualitative research orientation. A sample of doctoral students' perceptions. Perceptions is what we measure in qualitative perceptions of why they have not managed to complete their dissertations. And then there's a set of research questions. This just shows you what is the difference between outlining the problem, having a purpose statement, and then having research questions that you're going to put into your interview schedule. Your qualitative research design must also be strategic and rigorous. Remember what I said, rigor is not just something that's just quantitative. Rigor is also needed in qualitative. Predict potential issues or problems and offer how you will plan to react to them. For example, you can think of your costs, your resources, in terms of your time, money. Do you have staff or assistants? Your relationships that you're going to form in the field, the level of participation needed by yourself and by the community or the interviewees that you're going to include, the competencies that you need, any gatekeepers that you need to work with and develop relationships with, how you will go and achieve those thick descriptions, the scope of your methods, and building rapport. Now, rapport is that you are building a relationship of trust with your gatekeepers and your interviewees. And therefore, qualitative research is often slow and time-consuming and difficult because you can't just rush in and complete a questionnaire. That is quantitative, that's a survey. Qualitative, we build that relationship of trust. And what often happens in qualitative research is that the first interviews that you do when you just enter the field are not very good, and sometimes I exclude my first interviews because I realize I haven't yet built the trust or the rapport that I wanted, and that people presented themselves differently to me before they got to know me better as a researcher. And as your engagement with the interviewees build over time, they start revealing different parts of themselves, or they start trusting to tell you a little bit more. And therefore your later interviews are the richer ones that you stick with. You need to ensure quality in your qualitative design by looking at the following criteria. You need to systematically plan this. You can't just hit the field and hope for the best. You need to have a reflexivity. That is that reflexive account where you take a notebook and a diary and you talk about your engagement, where you would write for yourself, I don't think these interviews were good, I'm going to redo them. Or I think these interviews were really a breakthrough moment where I felt I've built that trust now. You'd note down names of people that you are being referred to other gatekeepers. So you really reflect on how you have come by this data in qualitative. You need to be open and flexible. Sometimes we follow new leads in the field that we didn't anticipate when we started. You need to be open to surprises. So you also need to surprise me as the reader or the consumer of your qualitative study, because as I said before, in qualitative we're inductive, in other words it's ampliative. We start off with the initial problem or an initial thing that we want to research, but in the field surprises come my way and I add to my questions. I need to show relevance, and then I triangulate my data from one interview to the next, or from my interview data against my literature review, or against other sources of data. Sampling strategies in qualitative designs. Now, most of our qualitative sampling is purposive. The word purposive means that I have purposefully or with a preconceived understanding went and I searched for the most data-rich cases that will be the closest to the data that I need to answer my research question. And there are loads of purposive sampling types. And I think most of us just say in a proposal purposive sampling, because then we know that we have now at least mentioned a sampling frame that is suitable to qualitative designs. But there are many types of purposive sampling. And those that I list here, you can use a mixture of them and still call what you do purposive sampling, and just explain that you've used these subtypes of purposive sampling in your work. The first one is called extreme or deviant cases. Those are the outliers, the people who are different. So you start researching, you start interviewing. Let's say it is interviews about worker burnout. Worker burnout in people working from home because of the COVID crisis. Do they experience more burnout? And you hear from about 5 or 6 of the interviewees, yes, they experience kind of the same burnout. They feel they work longer hours, they feel disconnected from their colleagues, whatever. Now you're going to have to go and look for the people who are different from this mainstream, because you need to, in the end, show a variety of voices. So there's also going to be that one person who says, but I don't experience burnout because I have found a way to deal with it. Or that person who have done it differently from all the others. So that's called extreme or deviant case, the outliers, the people who are different from the norm, because the difference shows why the norm is the norm. You also can go and look for typical cases, the usual, the average person, or the key informant. That's a key informant sampling is typical case sampling, where you know this person is a typical case who would have experienced this particular phenomenon. You look and do what is called critical case or intensity, where that person is experiencing this problem right now very intensively and very critically. For example, women suffering from postpartum depression. You would purposely sample them. It's no use talking about the lived experience of this and you're talking to people who've never had this. So you can also go and look at maximum variation, where we get a pattern or themes amongst a varied group. You can set criteria where you say there are preset criteria. For example, I want to talk about the water shortage in a particular neighborhood. Then I might say, okay, my criterion needs to be that these need to be adult people, people who would typically gather the water for the household. So maybe it's adult women in a household, and people who've at least lived in this area and experienced the deteriorating water situation for the last 5 years. Can you see I've set criteria for who am I going to select? So that's a type of criterion, purposeful sampling. There's also something called theoretical sampling, where you beforehand say, okay, these are the categories of people I need to include. If I look, for example, at leadership styles in an organization, I want to look at somebody who's a service leader, somebody who's pragmatic, somebody who's charismatic, somebody who's very rule-oriented, somebody who is perhaps draconian and authoritarian. So I would say I need to have interviews with each one of these theoretical cases to fill them out, to extend my theoretical categories of leadership styles. Then we also get something called snowball or referral sampling or chain sampling. Now, I've listened to another presentation earlier this year where somebody said there's no such thing as snowball sampling. No, there really is something called snowball sampling in purposive sampling, in qualitative sampling. It's also called referral or chain sampling. And you would often use that when you go into an area and you might not fully know the leadership structures or the setup of the community. Then I use referral sampling or chain sampling. In other words, I start with some of the gatekeepers, and very soon from my notes, I would see, okay, but they all refer me to this one person in this neighborhood or in this community that will be able to give me access to other data sources or tell me something or has the most knowledge or is typically the research person to which people go with their problems. So in that way, I snowball. As a snowball goes down a mountain, it gathers more. I refer from one link of the chain to the next. I get more and more data sources that I can use in my qualitative sampling to get to the number of interviewees that I need to be able to say, I have now rich data, I've got thick data, and I can describe it. You get opportunistic sampling. This can happen, for example, you are doing ethnographic work and you're sitting in the community and you're participating in one of the community meetings, and then at that opportunity you now opportunistically start sampling people in that meeting who you think made interesting comments. You can also get stratified purposive sampling where you've got specific subsets. This would be, for example, if I'm doing ethnographic work in a particular organization and I'm going to purposefully select people who are from management, people who are from middle management, and then people who work at the cold face. Now, when I'm talking sampling in qualitative, there is a word I must also mention, and that word is called saturation. Now, that word means exactly what it says, and that's why I've got a picture of a stick figure who is saturated with raindrops. It means that you have gathered so much data that you are now saturated with data. In other words, if I do one more interview, if I select one more case study, if I do one more focus group study, I'm just going to get redundancy. I'm just going to get the same. I'm not going to get anything new. And that is what you need to prove through your saturation. There's also something called theoretical saturation that refers back to that theoretical sampling that I explained earlier. What is a sample size in qualitative approaches? I'm going to show you some guidelines in the next slide. But remember this, and really, colleagues, I found this for myself so many times, and I'm becoming more and more convinced of this every day when I am involved in research or guiding someone else's research or adjudicating it. It is that the most difficult thing to unlearn for any researcher is our positivistic quantitative inclinations, because we were taught that, and it was very rule bound, and it gets repeated in methodology book after methodology book and in lecture after lecture that there are particular rules. And then the rules of this positivist quantitative stuff sits in our head, and when we're going qualitative, we try and go back there instead of thinking, oh, no, I chose the qualitative path. Different rules apply. So in your reflexivity, fight those quantitative inclinations. Fight them. Go and read up and go qualitative. Go full time qualitative if you chose this path. Because what you think of when you think sampling is only sampling people. But when we're doing qualitative, we remember our view of the forest. We didn't just include the tree trunks, we included everything. So in qualitative designs, we don't just sample people, we also sample events. I told you about the community meeting. That was an event that I sampled. I go and sample settings, and I sample different things, not just people. Here are suggested sample signs in qualitative designs, and I've also have all the references there for you. So if in your own time you want to go and read this again, you've got all the references there, and you can use these as guidelines. But let me just say, if you're an honors student, often in your 101 for your honors project, we suggest a minimum number of interviews, and perhaps they say 5 interviews would be enough. So these suggested sample sizes are larger, and it's more for people who are doing masters and doctorates. So there's a difference there. So if you're doing your master's and your doctorate, and you want to look at what is roughly an acceptable sample size given your design decisions, then here is a guideline for action or grounded theory research. It's about 20 to 30 case studies. If it's one case that you sample, you triangulate it with 25 to 30 other data sources, or you use 15 to 30 interviews. If you've got more than one case, between 4 to 10 cases. Can you see it's wide ranges? Because the focus is on the richness of the data. So you can read these through in your own time, and please bear in mind that there's a difference between what we want at the honors level often and what we want at the higher levels of study. Who is the qualitative researcher? The qualitative researcher needs to have a particular inclination to the research, because it's not about extracting data from people. We don't parachute in, extract data from people and leave them. It's not about acquiring. It is about learning. You need to be changed through your encounter. You need to have been confronted with new knowledge in the qualitative field that you didn't think of, because we're moving beyond our initial problem. It's about understanding, the understanding of yourself and the understanding of the people that you co-construct your data with. So you need to reflect, contemplate, and listen. You need to take reasoned decisions. You need to really appreciate and honor the people through how you represent them. Make sure that it's a true representation, that it's a representation with dignity and honor, because people invite you into their lives when you're doing qualitative research, and we need to honor that. You need to be comfortable with ambiguity, but you need to be very self-disciplined and have perseverance. There are days in the field where you will be tired, where you will be confronted with things that are difficult, but you need to then go and remind yourself, why I did the research in the first place. And on that diagram there is from Michael Quinn-Patton's work on how I write my reflexive notes. In other words, what are my reflective screens? What is my own age, culture, gender, sexuality, class, my praxis, my education, and how does it differ from my research participants? Instrumentation in qualitative designs. This is, what instruments do I use? Now, your interview instrumentation has got many possibilities. The word questionnaire fits with quantitative designs and surveys. The word used for our instrument in a qualitative design is interview guide or observation guide. So there are two possibilities. We can ask questions from groups or from individuals. Individual question asking strategies could be your interview schedule, which could be semi-structured versus completely unstructured. Life history or oral history interviewing. You can do narrative interviewing, where you ask people to tell you the story of. You can do your key informant interviewing, or you can ask people to write down journals. Let's say it's somebody who has recovered from COVID-19 infection, and you give them a journal and you ask them to write their stories, and that becomes another data point for triangulation in addition to your interviews. Your interview schedule has some golden rules. You always introduce your topic so that people don't wonder what your study is about. You need to say, this is what my study is about, and we need to de-jargonate it for our audience. In other words, if you're using a very highfalutin word such as, what are the sustainable livelihood strategies, then people in the street might not know what you mean by it, so you define it for them. Your interview schedule needs to cover your objectives, otherwise you will have objectives in your proposal that's not covered by data. It needs to have conversational elements. And as I said before, unlearn your quantification, unlearn your positivism. So don't just pepper people with questions. It's got to have a conversational element. So it says, tell me about. And then you follow up that lead with probes. You test. You contrast views. You ask for silences. You allow for silences. You ask people to give you a specific example of this lived experience. And you direct and you repeat, because we've got 2 ears to listen with, 1 mouth to speak with. When we're a qualitative researcher, we listen. We ask, but we listen a lot because we want to get to shared meaning. So you've got to show in building your rapport that you've listened well to what your interviewee has said to you. You repeat it and say, did I understand this correctly? And that leads to further conversations. So try and elicit reflexive discussions. Try and avoid yes-no questions, because we're not asking a questionnaire, we are interviewing. In group strategies, that is, for example, when you're doing focus groups, You can use something called photo voice. That's where people bring in a photo of this particular issue that they are worried about and that you want to research. And you can show the photos or put them up in a board to elicit the discussions. Or you can set up a focus group interview schedule. Keep them short, please, because what you want is that participation by the group. Or you can think of other participatory methods, such as people setting up decision trees or doing some mapping exercises. If you're interested in those and you want more reading material on it, then please contact me. I'd gladly share or tell you where to go and look to find more information on any of these strategies. We can also sometimes have observational instrumentations. That's where I only observe something, and then what do I put in an observational schedule? I use the acronym ACT to remember that. If I am just observing, let's say I'm sitting at the back of a community meeting and I'm just observing, then I usually draw a mind map for myself with the acronym ACT, where I ask myself, who are the actors? What are the people here? What are their relationships? What are their emotions that they're revealing, their opinions? What are they doing? How do they frame their actions? How do they understand this issue? Then I write notes on the context. What is happening here? What is the scene? How are people achieving X or Y? Why? What are my reflective observer notes? This is working well. This is not working. This is something I need to follow up. And the last thing that I write as an observational note is the time, because it's unique. It's happening now. Where is it located, and how does it fit into the present, the past, and an imagined future? Ethnography is a particular type of qualitative data gathering that we can use, and here I would use both observation and interviews. Ethnography is a slow type of research, so if you're doing this, understand that you need to be in the field for quite a number of days, weeks, sometimes several months, because you need to immerse yourself in the setting and have extended interactions with people. It's all about listening and field notes. You collect various documents when you're doing ethnography. Even if you're working inside an ethnography of an organization, collect as much documentation as you can. Nowadays, we often also get a lot of information on websites of organizations. Access negotiation is very important. And also how you leave the field, because if we've been staying in a community or in an organization for extended time, we can't just abruptly leave. We need to give some feedback, and we need to make sure that we leave that field in an ethical manner as well. With qualitative interviewing, it is about being less structured, so it's not a questionnaire, it's not yes/no questions. It really should imitate a conversation. You need to have sometimes a follow-up interview, especially if it's all about building rapport. Your interview guide is not a questionnaire. Be a good listener and get a recording device, please. You need to record your interview. You need to ask permission from your interviewees to record, but there needs to be evidence that you have actually gathered this data. You need to know what it's all about. So your pre-testing is important. Pre-test your interview schedule. Also, do all your reading beforehand. It's unethical to go and do research about a topic and you haven't done as much reading so that you are informed and know which questions to ask. You need to have a conversation with a purpose with people, but be gentle, respectful, ethical, interested, listen, be open, but follow up on inconsistencies, and your interpretation starts at your very first interview. If this is the first interview that you've ever done in your life, what can you expect? A first interview is very scary. You might think, oh, I'm very good at speaking to people, and the people in this community know me and they respect me, and I'll get all their cooperation. But when you actually sit down and you reflect on it, you understand it's this intrusion in someone else's life. And it can be daunting. So go and practice it beforehand. If you say this interview would last for 40 minutes, go and test whether it's 40 minutes or whether it is less. Know that there will be distractions, kids running, phones going off, your equipment, your recording equipment not working. Be prepared, know how to handle them. Know how to deal with intrusive biases and expectations from your side, from the interviewee side. Sometimes students come back and say, the people didn't speak. I asked them all these interesting questions, but they hardly responded. It is because you haven't yet built the rapport. And you need to understand that this will happen. So go and do a follow-up interview and see if you can do it. Change your strategies, find a way to resolve it. And what the student says, must I do everything? Yes, because you are the instrument. You're going to have to do the recording, the listening and the probing. Unless you're doing focus groups, you can perhaps have an assistant who can also help and do some of the recording, do some of the note taking. I would recommend it if you're working with group data that you've got somebody who assists, just because it can be so chaotic and you need to be sensitive. Are there alternatives to in-person data collection? I think this was especially a worry for students when we still had COVID restrictions. We don't have the same restrictions, but we still have the obligation of keeping people safe. So there are other possibilities than in-person data collection. There's ethnography, where you do ethnography on the internet. You may be forced to consider this. Your research participants are not physically present, hence you lose a lot of your context and your nonverbal clues when you go non-person. But we still need to talk to people as embodied subjects, and they are still performing their identities. There are other possibilities, and there are resources that you can go and look at, and there are telephonic interviews, but they can be expensive. There's instant messaging interviews, there are emailed questionnaires, there are online blogs, and there are video conference interviews. But each one of these have got very specific ethical considerations. So it's best, if you want to go this route, to go and read up at this resource site as to what they mean and what problems they might present. Focus group interviews are very popular, often with students, but I need to present the caveat that focus groups is not an easy way to get a lot of data in one swipe. Focus groups are more involved than this, so we always need to understand why we do focus groups. And the reason why we do any kind of group data collection is that we need to understand what the group adds. In other words, what does a group add to an interview that I cannot get from an individual interview? And what a group adds is the group dynamics, where the people sit together. Maybe they need to work together, or they live together, and the one person's ideas sparks ideas or conversations in someone else. So if you can't prove that that group dynamic is key to answering your research questions or your objectives, then you've got serious problems in legitimizing why a focus group is the best. You can be the moderator, but get a note taker, as I said, because these things can be complex. Understand where your venue is. Make it a secure venue. Think of your group sizes. The optimal is 8. Any group size beyond that, there will people who will just simply not get the time to speak. It is a carefully planned discussion about a defined interest area. It needs to be a permissive, non-threatening environment. Biases can come in group interviews. You can get domineering types or passive participants who never say a word. They're part of your group, but they never say a word. So you need to have strategies to make them speak. You need to have strategies on how to deal with the domineering type who says, oh no, I can answer for the entire group now. You need to think about the depth. You can't really go hugely in depth with group interviews. Why? Because we cannot promise anonymity. The group will know one another. So you've got a problem with anonymity, you've got a problem with confidentiality and sensitivity. So don't ask sensitive issues through group interviews. It's not suitable for that. And it's especially a problem when you're dealing with a community where people might go out there and gossip and say, oh, did you hear what Auntie Agnes said in that group interview? So be careful about how you use your focus groups. And nowadays, we also need to think about people's safety concerns when we set the focus group interview and the venue and where it is at. Here's an example of a focus group interview. You would see it's open, but it's an introduction. There's a closing to it. You can read this for yourself to see what it looks like. We've got visual methods that we can use, such as photo voice. It's a lovely visual method and it's always used to start off certain things. You can read this for yourself if you're interested in photo voice. There is also something called post-qualitative methods, where that is a lot of forward-looking work. We're looking a lot more into work that is a lot more participatory. Again, I would urge you to read this for yourself because our time is running. If you're interested in this, please do so. You are allowed to be cutting edge. You are allowed to be innovative. You are allowed to fully embrace all the wonderful methodological things that are waiting there for you to use them and discover them and bring them out. So please be adventurous if you like, but always understand that if I've chosen a quantitative or a qualitative path, I need to be true to it and I need to explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. When I'm doing qualitative data analysis, what am I using as my data? It would be your field notes, your observational notes, and your audio recorded interview data. There are general strategies such as analytical induction that you use or grounded theory analysis. Thematic analysis, I think, is most popular with our students doing qualitative work, or narrative analysis. It is recursive. In other words, you need to go and write down your first interview, and then you start at your first interview. You already start by looking at themes that are emerging from people speak with you or from your observational notes. Transcription is analysis. I always recommend to my students that they do their own transcriptions, because it's only when you listen to yourself and your interview that you understand it better. So I don't like students using transcription services. Try and transcribe your own interviews, do it verbatim, and add your subtle details where you start showing how you build the rapport, that you were comfortable with the silences. Your transcription of your own work builds your own theoretical sensitivity. In other words, you immediately see themes that are emerging. It brings you closer to your data because what did we say? As a qualitative researcher, I'm immersed in my data. I'm saturated by it. It gives you a unique opportunity to critique and improve on your own interview process. It helps you to add your viewpoint. It helps you to be reflexive and to address issues of authority and representation. Triangulate your data from multiple sources. In other words, you can triangulate between your interview data, whether it was individual or focus group, with other data sources, documents that you discovered, your own notes. Write down your impressions right after the interview. So when you've completed your interview, even though you are tired after that first interview, if you truly listened well, please go and still write it up that night. It gives you all that richness of the data. If time elapses between that interview and when you transcribe it, there are details that we will forget because we've got fallible brains. Pay close attention to your deviant cases, those outliers, those people who are different, because they help illustrate your norm. Pay close attention to your accounting strategies. What do I mean that? It's the audit trail to where you account for how did this data come about? How do I use data to make my argument? I use it as evidence. I use it as interpretation, narrative, to tell a convincing story, to use a range of sources, evocatively, illustratively, that gripping real life or emotional story that you compellingly retell. I give multiple voices a chance to speak through my data. Grounded theory, if you're going grounded theory, understand that you need to go and read up on grounded theory. Don't just throw it in there thinking, okay, my lecturer would understand I'm doing grounded theory and that's an acceptable qualitative analysis strategy. I'm just saying this is grounded theory. It implies a particular way of looking at your data, where you first do open and initial coding, where you code everything. In other words, you've got your transcription here and you code line by line, you underline keywords and you break up that text. This is followed by axial coding, where you put them back together to form themes, and then selective coding, where you start putting hierarchical themes together. And you need to do theoretical sampling. That means that I've got an ideal type. Here is an ideal type of a service leadership. This is what I've got here, and this is an authoritative leader, and this is what I've got here. So you need to flesh them out. Understand what you mean when you say I'm going grounded theory. Most students like thematic analysis. It's a very difficult field because it doesn't have a lot of rules. But Brown and Clark says it's a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns or themes within the data. So first of all, you need to decide what a theme is. The theme is not just your research objective or question you've posed in your interview. It needs to be broader than that, because I'm connecting things about lived experiences, understanding, and meaning making. If you've got access to Atlas TI, use it by all means. It helps you to identify themes, even if in the end you say, this is what Atlas TI found. I've gone a bit off script here and included my own themes. That is fine, but it is a software that is available. The first step is to familiarize, really read your transcript several times. There's often when I check a student's thematic analysis where I can see that the theme is not well populated. In other words, they only have one example of this theme. And then I wonder, is this a theme now, or are there other examples? And you can only answer those questions if you really read all your transcripts very well. You need to read it several times. Then you need to code very carefully and extract your themes, review those themes, and in reviewing your themes, it's best to do it in collaboration with. If you've got that kind of relationship with a supervisor that you can sit down and say, these were my initial themes, I had 10 of them. I want to reduce them to the 5 most important ones. Can we talk through it? Then that would be a lovely way to go about it. If your supervisor is not somebody who would sit down and review your themes with you, find a colleague, a trusted colleague, somebody with some experience of thematic analysis and qualitative work, and make sure that what you capture is experiences, not responses to questions, experiences, meanings. How do people interpret this thing and the reality of my participants? Be selective when you do your quotes. Think, what are you expected by them? Don't overwhelm your reader with too much detail. You can always put all your transcription somewhere else, but don't overwhelm the reader. Rather tell a compelling story. Be rigorous and thorough. Don't cherry pick your data, just those very provocative interview snatches. Don't cherry pick. Fill out your themes fully. Be investigative and creative. And remember that when you do qualitative research, it needs to be a really good story. You need to, I say there in the 3rd bullet point, qualitative data analysis fails when it is unable to represent the unseen and the unsayable. In other words, I need to get to that richness, that thickness of the data, where I now uncover things that would not have been there if I just look at the surface. Be reflexive, but not self-absorbed. Immerse yourself in your data. And look at there are few agreed upon canons for qualitative data analysis in the sense of shared ground rules for drawing conclusions and verifying sturdiness. So you're a little bit on your own, but fortunately, lots of examples of people who've done it before. Find the one that really is qualitative in the sense that it tells a compelling story, and see if you can replicate that in your own data. Here's an example. It was work by Janet Carsten, who spoke about after kinship, what happens to people when they move, when they are dislocated from their family homes. And she makes general claims in her data and appeal to common sense everyday knowledge first. For many people, the memories of houses inhabited in childhood have an extraordinary evocative power. Then she takes that general claim to a personal experience, elements of a reflexive validation or evocation. My own powerful house memories focus on a large kitchen table at which not only cooking and eating, but also most family discussions, communal homework, and many games took place. Can you see? The story evolves from a general idea to this is shared. I share this with my interviewees, and then she links it to a general point with some concepts and a theoretical proposition. As the example of my parents' house suggests, for those who are later uprooted, the memories of houses occupied in childhood or by previous generations may be especially powerful. Dislocation in space may be erased by evocations of past practices that are given a stable location in the house. Look at the storytelling structure, and then you understand what I mean with thick description. You start with something that's general, something that's reflexive, and then something that's unique to the research itself. This is just a repeat. This is about coding again. This is about open and actual coding. Narrative analysis is different from thematic and grounded theory. It is where it's more suitable to history, oral history, or telling some people story, if you're using 2 or 3 people as a case study to tell the entire history, then you look at the story of lived experience and you look at characters, settings, events, audiences, causal relationships between events and how people are shaped, and themes. Now, when we look at reliability and validity in qualitative research, again, please relearn your positivistic inclinations and relearn the qualitative one. Then we don't talk about reliability and validity. We use the keywords trustworthiness and authenticity. So trustworthiness is about whether your data is credible. In other words, if I read this, if I read your study, does it give me that view like I was on your shoulder when you did this research? You can add to your credibility by triangulating your interview data with other data points or asking your respondents to validate your themes. You can look at trustworthiness in terms of transferability. In other words, I can so identify with this because there's a thick description. Dependability is the audit trail. That is where you write up in your chapter every step you've taken to gather your data. Confirmability is about your reflexive accounts. Authenticity is where you have adhered to the principle of fairness by including the right people, the most data-rich people in your research, and being fair in the way that you represent them. It's about ontological authenticity, that is, that this research has led to understanding, to you being changed because you have achieved that meaning making. It is educative, it is often transformative and tactical. And other quality criteria that we need to look at in a qualitative study is that there is the sensitivity to context. It mustn't read like an American story. It must read like the story of the community where you did your research at. There's a commitment to rigor. There's transparency in how you came about your data and coherence. And you have looked at impact and importance in your work. Here is another summary of the techniques for establishing trustworthiness. Trustworthiness through prolonged engagement, where you build that trust and develop rapport, you build relationships, you obtained a wide scope of data. Persistent observation, you've got in-depth data. Triangulate, you verify. Referential adequacy, where you provide that slice of life, a typical example of what is happening here. And you can also do peer debriefing. You don't have to do all of these. You can do some of these. Further establishing of trustworthiness is through what we call membership checking, where you perhaps give your list of themes back to the people who participated in your study and say, did I miss a theme? Would you agree with these? Reflexive journals and thick description, you've got to show that purposive sampling, that you've got the data, rich people included in your sampling, that you've looked how you can use the different types of purposive sampling, and that you've got a clear audit trail where you say, this is how my data came about. When I'm doing qualitative research approaches, often where I need to justify, why did I go qualitative? I need to say, what are the strengths of a qualitative study? It is because it gives me texture data that's able to reveal things that are unknown, unsaid, unexpected things. It allows me to gain insight, to give voice to represent people who haven't been represented in data before. I challenge the idea of me being a researcher, being different from the research. I want to be able to get to that understanding of living their lives through their eyes. I want to have empathetic understanding and engaged inquiry. It builds on an inductive logic. In other words, it is grounded in experience and it adds to the questions. It enables me to describe context and generate discourses or arguments about a topic. I can see a process unfolding in qualitative research. For example, I can see if there's an intervention in an organization or a group or community, how it changes. It's flexible. It can be made very participatory if I'm in a qualitative study, and thereby become emancipatory for the people to participate in. What are the weaknesses of a qualitative approach? It would be subjective. It can sometimes not be representative enough. You cannot always replicate a study. It's not the idea to replicate. We never generalize from a qualitative study because it's not why we do a qualitative study. We don't want to generalize and be able to test hypotheses and say, okay, this applies to all communities everywhere. It is unique. And please, as I say, unlearn your positivistic inclinations by looking at what makes qualitative research quality research. Here are some resources that you can go and look up for yourself. Some key readings that you might find useful are all in our library. And then thank you and good luck.